everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So today we are going to talk about auto layouts. I'll walk you through how you can create them and why it's important in your designs, showing you real life example. So first things first, what exactly is an auto layout? An auto layout is a feature in Figma to help you resize your designs automatically based on the content inside of it. It could be used on buttons, frames, hearts, so that when you add a text or resize an element, you don't have to manually fix things for it to align together. Let's see what that means in Figma. To further demonstrate this auto layout, we are going to show this using a simple button. So let's just say we have a text here. So to make this text an auto layout, we can either right click on it and then we click on this add auto layout option we have here. So once you hover on the left panel, you can see auto layout. Or we can first of all make it a frame, and then once you hover on this layout section, you can see these four icons here. Toggle auto layout automatically makes it an auto layout. Or we can also just click on Shift A, which is the easiest method. So once we do that, it makes this text an auto layout. And let's change the background so we can see what's happening inside of it. Let's give our auto layouts a radius of 20. So like we said, an auto layout changes according to what is inside of it. So let's try to make this text longer and see what happens to the auto layout. So you can see that this button is getting longer. So that is also applies even when the button is short. Another layout this auto layout is making different frames a single auto layout. So here we have about 5 frames, and as you can see, it's arranged in a horizontal line, but however they are not on a straight line and the spacing in between them are not uniform. So once you put all these frames on auto layout by clicking on Shift A, Figma automatically arranges these frames on a single line, and it will take the horizontal form because that was how the frames were initially arranged. And Figma will also make the space in between the frames to be uniform. So you can see here 13, 13, 13. So on this frame, you can see that the arrangements on this place is horizontal. However, if you want to change it to vertical, once you click on this place, it changes to vertical. The first symbol here is freeform. This is when there is no auto layout. So you can see either the vertical or horizontal. You can see this blue highlighted to show that there's an auto layout. But the moment you click on this freeform, it's no longer an auto layout. You can see that that blue highlights that was there before is no longer there, showing that this frame is no longer an auto layout. But however, we want it to be an auto layout, so we'll make it back to be horizontal. This grid, let's try to illustrate what this grid means with this second frame. So once you put it on a grid, so presently the grid is 5 by 1, meaning that there are 5 columns and 1 row. But once you click on it, you can decide to make it 2 by 2, that is 2 columns and 3. It's in 3 rows because you have about 5 elements. So on this grid, we can decide to move an element to another grid, or we can decide to even expand it. Say we want this to take a full row of that grid, we can also decide to do that. So that is the feature of what this grid stands for. Let's go back to our main auto layout. We have gone through this freeform, vertical, horizontal, and grid. Now let's go through this wrap. On this place is wrap. So presently it's not really showing what this wrap is because they are all on a straight line. But if we decide to reduce the length of this, let us change the background to white so you can see what's going on here. So if we decide to change the length of this frame, we can see that the ones that could not enter on that line will move on to the next line. That is what this wrap feature is for. However, you can see that these elements are just glued into its border. So let's say we want to make a little bit of spacing on each of the border. So let's say for this is the left and right border, let's increase it to like 20. So we can also come here and increase the top and bottom to 20. However, if we want to update all 4 borders at once, we click on command and click on it, and then we can update everything at once. So let's still leave it back to 20. So another thing that we can also do on this auto layout is to duplicate a particular element. So once we click on duplicate or command D or control D, it duplicate an element and still maintain that position that you have initially created for the auto layout. Same thing if you want to move an object from a position to another position, you click on that element and then you click on your arrow key. You can see that this our shirt is moving according to how we want it to move, depending on where we want the position to be. So the next is to start playing around with the width and the height. So let's try to see what this width. When we click on it, you can see fixed width, hug content, fill container, add minimum width, add max width, apply variable. So I'm going to go through each of these different options. So the very first option is fixed width. So what this fixed width is saying is that we want this frame to always be this width, whichever number that you set it. We are telling Figma that we want this frame to always be 120 regardless of the content that is within it. So let's try to change this content and add as much width as we want. So you can see that the content is now overflowing the frame because we have put a restriction to how wide this width can be. So the same goes for the height. So once you click on the height and then we click on the drop down on the height part, and we can see this fixed width. So let's say we want to set the fixed width to also be 120. So we are also telling Figma that we want this height of this frame to always be this 120 regardless of the content that is within it. So even if we make this content as long as possible, it's going to overflow the frame. Same goes for the next option. So let's click on this frame. So we want to click on the hug width and the hug height. So let's go to our width and then we go to the second option, hug content. So we are telling Figma, hug this content and don't allow it to breathe. So once we click on this frame and then we tell it to hug the content, so you can see that it's hugging it but it's respecting the padding rule that is inside of it. Let's try to remove this padding and see what happens. So you can see how it's shrinking the content inside of it. Let's also set the height to also hug content and then remove the padding that is inside of it, and you can see how this frame is hugging this content, not allowing it to breathe. So if we change the content inside of it, it's always going to be expanding whether on the width or whether on the height because we have set the width and the height to hug this content. So the next on the list is fill width and fill height. So once you go to our width and you can see on this third option, you can say fill width. But once you hover on this fill width, you can see this red arrow that is stretching from the frame out to its container, showing that this frame is going to stretch to fill up the space that is within its container. So let's click on this fill width and see what happens. So you can see it tried to fill up the container. However, it's also observing that there is also a frame beside of it, so we cannot try to overlook that frame. So we respect that frame and then we fill as much space as we can. So the same goes to the height. So once we click on the height and then we say fill container, the same arrow stretches up, showing that it's going to expand to fill up the space of this height. And then once we click on this fill height, you can see that it fill up the container without any restriction because there is no frame on top of it. So it now covers the entire container. So let's try to change the width of, let's try to change the contents of this and you can see what happens. This frame is just following the surrounding of where it is, not the content. So it's saying I'm filling up this container regardless of what is inside of me. So the same will also go for this second option we have here, fill width and add minimum width. So let's try to also click on this fill container and see what happens to our first frame. So once we click on it, we add fill container. So you can see that it has reduced the width of this first frame, meaning that both the first frame and the second frame are both trying to fill as much space as possible. Both of them have to share the available space between themselves equally without cheating themselves. So that even if we try to resize it, the frame inside of it is going to adjust according to its container. So let's try to increase the container. So you can see that this frame is also increasing in the width because we have set the width to fill the container. So same goes to when we are also reducing it. It continues filling and then it's now squashing themselves. So if you are now trying to avoid the width from getting so tiny, we can now set a minimum width. So let's set a minimum width on this first frame we have here. So once we click on the width, and then you can see add minimum width. So let's say we want it not to go below 100. So once we add it and then we try to reduce the width of the frame, you can see that it's no longer squeezing itself because we have set a restriction that we don't want this frame to go less than 100. However, if you want to remove the width that you have set, all you have to do is go to the minimum width and then you click on it and remove minimum width or set to current width, whichever option you want. So next, let's go to a real life example. So we have this bottom nav and then we are trying to make this to be responsive, and then you can see that presently it's not responsive. So if we want to make this to be responsive, we have our individual frames that is inside the container. So we want these different icons to be able to fill up the container as much as possible. We set each of the widths of all the frames to the fill container so that however the size of the container, the frames inside of it are all going to share the space equally, so that once we adjust the nav, the frames is going to readjust according to the space and then making it responsive. So our next real life example is these cards that we have here. So let's try to make use of everything you've learned in this video. First, we are going to highlight our cards and then click on Shift A, so it automatically creates an auto layout for us. So let's go to our first card and let's set the width to fill container. So because the container has not changed, the first card is still going to be the same width, but let's try to increase the width of the container. So you can see that this first card width is changing to accommodate the width of the container. However, this second and third cards are still the same because we set them as fixed and we have not changed the width from fixed to fill. So let's try to change it. Let's make the second card to fill container. So you can see that the first card has readjusted to accommodate the fill container of the second card. Let's also make this third card to also be fill container. So you can see that all the whole cards are readjusting themselves to accommodate each other, so that once we change the container, all the cards are changing according to how we want the container to be. So however, if you want a case whereby you can see that once you reduce the width of this container, the overflowing frame is still there, but if you want this third container to move on to the next line once the container width has reduced, what we have to do is to set this width to hug contents instead of fixed width. So let's set our container width to hug contents and then we put it on wrap, so that once we reduce the width of this container, any overflowing card is going to move on to the next line. The same goes for this also, it's going to move on to the next line. So let's put back our first frame to fill container, put back the second frame to fill container, also this to fill container, so that once we are reducing, they are changing according to the width of the container. Okay, so the last but not the least is our avatars we have here. So we have them on auto layouts by clicking on Shift A. So we can easily change the padding in between them by hovering on this, and then we can change it as we want, or we can decide to put the padding to auto, so that however we want the container to be, the padding is going to readjust according to how wide or how slim the container is. So let's just say that the padding is on negative, and then once we go on this auto layout settings, we can see different options. These strokes here, we have the included. If we want the auto layout to include the stroke or not, that is where the included or excluded comes in. Then this canvas stacking, because our auto layout is on negative, is stacking on itself, so we can change it to first on top or last on top. So for this last option on align text baseline, let's change the sizing of our auto layouts to better demonstrate it. Once we click on the advanced setting, if we toggle on this align text layout, it's going to align all our frame on the baseline irrespective irrespective of the size of each of the frame. And once you toggle it off, it aligns it at the center. Let's try to make it wide and fill our background with white. So on this other segment also, we can see that it is distributed on the frame, on the entire container, because our padding is on auto. So if we want to remove our padding from auto to a particular number, we can either double click on this section, or we can go to this part and then change it back to a number. So let's say we now want it to be on 20. So once we change it, and then we can also determine where the avatars are going to be on this frame. So let's increase this frame. Presently, our avatars are centered on the left and on the middle. So once we click on this, it goes top, and the same thing goes to any segments you want it to be. And once you double click on any part of the container, it's now distributed, changing the padding to be auto. With this, we've come to the end of today's video on auto layouts. I hope you learned a lot and will start implementing it in your designs. Please don't forget to like, comment, and share. Stay tuned for more design content. Bye.